As the 1830s dawn in America, we enter a period much less congenial and far darker. As political rifts widened, you could feel it in the air. America was headed for something calamitous. This is the story of that time. I'm Anne Grace Evans, and this is a practical guide to American history. Andrew Jackson, like any other populist politician, was so popular because he set out to give the people exactly what they wanted, which is what all Americans wanted, their own sphere of influence in the world, somewhere to call home and the peace of mind to enjoy it undisturbed. To Jackson, this could only be achieved by opening new territories for settlement. As for the people already living there, they would simply have to be moved somewhere else. A signature piece of legislation for Andrew Jackson was the Indian Removal Act, what we now know as the Trail of Tears. One of the darker stains on our history, the Indian Removal Act of 1830 forced millions of indigenous people off their lands to lands that the federal government designated for them west of the Mississippi. In congressional debates, this was described as, quote, an exchange of lands, rather than a seizure. Proponents of the bill framed it as a measure to ensure the safety of white settlers, claiming any violence that arose on the frontiers was instigated by the Creeks and the Choctaws. Opponents of the measure saw it as the United States going back on its word, dating from the time of George Washington, that the United States would respect Cherokee boundaries, and any future disputes over land would be settled in consultation with the Cherokee. Congressman Davy Crockett, whom legend would call King of the Wild Frontier, went even further, calling the Indian Removal Act wicked and unjust. Though the act ultimately passed, the authority of the government to interfere in the governing of indigenous land was then challenged in the Supreme Court case of Worcester v. Georgia. The state of Georgia had taken action against people living on Cherokee land without a state license, and the court had ruled that they had no jurisdiction to do so. The Cherokee Nation was a sovereign nation and was not subject to the whims of an outside government. Jackson was reported to say in response to the ruling, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." In defiance of the Supreme Court, Jackson pressed forward with the Indian Removal Act. Indigenous people could choose to remove themselves voluntarily, or else the military would force them from their homes. Tens of thousands of Creek, Choctaw, Seminole, Chickasaw, and Muskogee were forcibly removed from their homes. Thousands died on the journey west from disease and exposure. The Indian Removal Act was not the only time that Jackson operated unilaterally to enforce his agenda. The Tariff of 1828, or the Tariff of Abominations, as its critics called it, was still causing problems. Farmers in the South especially hated it. John C. Calhoun, the man, if you'll recall, who had originally supported the tariff as part of a larger bluff to get the New England faction in Congress to oppose any future tariffs, now was facing consequences of his actions. So for his new plan, he wouldn't go to Congress. Instead, he'd urged his fellow statesmen in South Carolina to put the idea of state sovereignty to the test by refusing to comply to the tariffs. In 1832, the state of South Carolina passed the Ordinance of Nullification, saying that they would not submit to the tariff, and if forced to, they would secede from the country altogether. Andrew Jackson would not stand for this, asking Congress for the Force Bill to allow him to take military action against South Carolina if they tried anything of the sort. Once again, it was Henry Clay, the great compromiser, who brought everyone back from the brink by proposing the Compromise Tariff of 1833. It would gradually lower tariffs, as long as South Carolina agreed to cool it, which they did. They repealed the Nullification Ordinance, but that didn't mean they would forget. With the Dallas Tariff of 1816, even the harshest critics of industrialization and what it would mean for more rural regions of the country could see that at a certain level, agriculture and manufacturing were dependent on one another, and therefore some measures like this were necessary. But times had changed, and as the paths of agricultural and industrial interests began to diverge, their goals became less aligned. King Cotton's power in the South had only grown as demand for cotton had grown. Industrial centers in New England were certainly customers, but Britain had become an even more significant consumer of American cotton, and farmers didn't need anything threatening that market. As for the industrial North, textile mills definitely continued to be important, but entrepreneurs were also beginning to turn their attention to other ventures that they wanted to give a chance to grow without being undercut by imports from abroad. Which brings us to the bank. That same Bank of the United States which Alexander Hamilton had traded the site of the nation's capital to get. His original had expired in 1812, but James Madison, who had been one of the strongest opponents against its creation, of all people, signed a 20-year charter for a second Bank of the United States in 1816. He did this because he realized he had to. In the intervening years, when there had been no bank, things had gotten a little crazy. People looking to buy land in the West could now do so easily. Too easily. Without a national bank, there weren't any strong rules about credit. That is, how much interest banks should charge. Meaning, if someone wanted to borrow money to buy a piece of land, they didn't really have to stretch themselves too far to do it. And that's problematic, because it makes more people believe that they can afford the risk. When everyone is clamoring to buy a certain asset, in this case land, it creates a bubble. The demand for land inflates the price beyond what it's actually worth. And the assumption that with low interest rates, you can afford the land is based on belief that the land will retain the value that you originally paid for it. Of course, this practice leads to inflation, which is why the Bank of the United States had to be resurrected. The Second Bank of the United States sought to stabilize the currency by keeping paper currency on hand from state banks and redeeming these notes for gold and silver in order to control banks' lending. But it was too little too late. If you don't take all of the air out of a bubble, eventually it pops. The bank had tried to influence lending policy, but it wasn't actually a central bank in the way that the modern-day Fed is. It couldn't actually make institutions do anything. So when a triggering event did come, in this case, a slowdown in global markets after the Napoleonic Wars, not enough had been done to prevent what happened next. Panic of 1819 caused the price of land to plummet. Speculators saw the value of their assets massively decrease. The bank had been too lax and nowhere near quick enough in tightening control of credit. Now, to make up for lost time, a new president of the bank sought to assert greater control by redeeming more state banknotes, a practice that bankrupted many banks because they didn't have enough gold and silver on hand. He also foreclosed on mortgages as people, finding themselves financially squeezed in this new landscape, started to default on their loans. This only contributed to a further depreciation in the value of land. The ensuing economic fallout was long and hard, and people blamed the bank. Though the speculators who had contributed to the bubble were by no means just northern industrialists. The whole situation had been facilitated by elites, the bankers who were behind the scenes shaping the nation's industries. And to most observers, it seemed like the Bank of the United States policies had only worsened matters. And in 1832, Andrew Jackson, populist that he was there to channel people's anger. He vetoed the continuation of the bank's charter, meaning that it would expire in 1836. To address any continuing issues with overspeculation in land, especially since his Indian Removal Act was set to open up millions of acres. He issued an executive order called the Specie Circular, decreeing that all payment for public lands must be made in gold or silver specie, not banknotes. For his actions around the bank, his political opponents labeled him a tyrant, with one political cartoonist depicting him as King Andrew I, holding a scepter and stomping on the U.S. Constitution. Yet Andrew Jackson remained extremely popular throughout his presidency because he seemed able to strong-arm his way through the corrupt mire of Washington, due process and long-term consequences be damned. This popularity helped his vice president, Martin Van Buren, get elected president after him. Here's the thing about populism. It promises an immediate result for a problem that is often far more complicated than voters appreciate. So killing the Bank of the United States, hated as it was going to have consequences, as people soon found out. Because there was going to be another land bubble. How could there not be in that environment? Except, unlike in 1819, now there was no national bank to help right the ship. And it was Jackson's Specie Circular, designed to prevent any bubble growing out of control, that actually ended up serving as one of the triggers of the Panic of 1837. Of course, this was the thing that was going to cause prices to fall, because what ordinary person actually has gold and silver on hand? The lesson here is there aren't really any quick and easy fixes when it comes to the economy, at least none that don't themselves carry new risks. The idea of long-termism, however, doesn't always occur to voters who see the situation before them and are angry about it. Naturally, the most seemingly obvious culprit is the one they'll turn to. Poor Martin Van Buren, although he was only inheriting a financial panic that was a result of Andrew Jackson's actions, was the seemingly obvious culprit. The panic officially started during the Van Buren administration, and so he was the one who was forced to own it. It was the perfect time for the anti-Jackson coalition to strike. Henry Clay, never a fan of Andrew Jackson's politics, was one of the leading figures in a new party along with Daniel Webster. They called themselves the Whigs, and in 1840 they were ready to put forward their first presidential ticket. Henry Clay had never quite been able to shake off the negative baggage of the corrupt bargain, and so they looked elsewhere for their candidate and settled on William Henry Harrison, hero of the wars with Tecumseh, as well as the War of 1812. His campaign slogan was Tippecanoe and Tyler too, recalling his military success at the Battle of Tippecanoe, and lumping in his running mate John Tyler somewhat as an afterthought. They ran on a platform of government action to promote business and the economy, a sort of continuation of Henry Clay's earlier American system, internal improvements and policies to promote business. This won over well because, at the time, the economy needed all the help it could get. During the panic, farms had depreciated in value, credit froze, major investment halted. Unlike the earlier Panic of 1819, which lasted for about 2 years, the Panic of 1837 lingered through to the mid-1840s. Banks failed, causing a chain reaction that led to mass unemployment. For the year of 1840, deflation was 6% across the board. The depression that the crash of 1837 caused was the worst the country had seen up to that point. Faced with this unprecedented crisis, it is interesting to see how society reacts to the needs of the people who are the most affected. In the mid-19th century, there was still no real infrastructure to introduce the type of welfare state that we might turn to in a time of economic downturn, such as unemployment or food benefits. But communities weren't completely blind to the needs of the destitute. Towns or counties would have an overseer of the poor, a sort of social worker who would do what he could for people who had fallen on hard times. The overseer of the poor was also responsible for the local workhouse, the place where the destitute could go to earn room and board. These weren't quite as bleak as their Dickensian counterparts, but ending up there wouldn't have been ideal. Sadly, this might be the fate of older Americans who could no longer work for a living and who could not fall back on younger relatives to support them. Perhaps it was these conditions that contributed to what is regarded as an age of reform. Many causes were taken up. Temperance crusaders preached the evils of alcohol. Abolitionists gained momentum. Activists for women's rights assembled at the Seneca Falls Convention. Horace Mann worked to improve the state of education, and Dorothea Dix campaigned for humane prison and asylum systems. A Frenchman, coming to America in 1835, observed the beginnings of this reform era. His name was Alexis Charles Henri Clorel, or the Comte de Tocqueville. In the book he wrote to detail his findings, he titled Democracy in America. Alexis de Tocqueville observed that Americans' devotion to education arose from their desire to have a population that could thoughtfully engage in public life. The commitment to public education, which had been a priority for the young nation since Puritan times, was teaching the next generation to think critically about the problems of the day. But it was also promoting the interaction of people from different backgrounds. If a pluralistic society, like the United States, is going to work, he concludes that the majority needs to learn how to live with and be tolerant of minority interests. But what most impressed him about America was that its deep religious roots gave it such a strong moral compass. That original Puritan work ethic, that idle hands are the devil's playthings, could be seen everywhere. People revel in hard work, and this, paradoxically, is what drives them. To work hard may have its beginnings in religious doctrine, but what de Tocqueville came to note was, quote, "I know of no country indeed where the love of money has taken a stronger hold on the affections of men." Industriousness and the pursuit of prosperity were baked into the American experience. America could trace its roots back to these Christian principles, but just like in the mid-18th century, there were those who believed that Americans had strayed too far from the true faith. The Second Great Awakening, much like the first, focused on a more lively and participatory form of worship. Preachers sought to shake up congregants with spectacle and a joyful atmosphere. As in the 18th centuries, these preachers were itinerant, moving from town to town, spreading their movement. But now, instead of preaching from the pulpit, these evangelicals would host large outdoor camp meetings where worshipers could mingle and move with the Spirit. These tent revivals were almost like the modern equivalent of a music festival. Days-long events where congregants gathered to boisterously sing and worship together. To more staid religious traditions, like the Congregationalists, with their sober hymn-filled services, these events would seem suspiciously improper, where young men and women would mix together unsupervised, and were encouraged to let go in ecstatic displays of devotion. Some religious denominations that grew out of the Second Great Awakening, like the Methodists, eventually came to be accepted in the more staid and conventional forms that we recognize today. But another denomination that originated in the Second Great Awakening, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, was deemed too unorthodox to coexist alongside more traditionally Puritan houses of worship. Everywhere they went, they seemed to be run out of town shortly afterward. After trying to make a go of things in the new state of Missouri, they realized they needed a new plan altogether. The only thing for them, as well as other independent-minded people like them, was to set off to create a new utopia in the Western Territories. Fur trappers and traders navigating the American interior had established routes to cut across the continent quickly. One of these, from the Missouri River to the Willamette Valley in Oregon, became the choice of adventurous pioneers looking to settle in new territories where they could live according to their own convictions. The first group of people to attempt the Oregon Trail was a group of men from Peoria, Illinois, who in the year 1839 were determined to claim Oregon as the new state in the United States of America. Though only half of this original group actually made it to Oregon, the example spurred the first wave of settler-laden wagons trundling west. Though the panics of the early 19th century had been brought on by intense speculation in Western lands, going west still remained the most viable option for anyone seeking to reinvent themselves and their fortunes. It was the fallout from the panic that drove many to take this path. Lots of people simply up and left as their debts became too much for them to pay. The phrase "gone to Texas," or GTT, started showing up on fence posts in abandoned house stores as people fleeing their creditors sought to make a new start in the Texas country. At the time, Texas was a Mexican territory, they themselves having recently gained their independence from Spain. But Texas's place in the Mexican state was never a comfortable or easy one. For one, the cultural makeup of Texas, with its large population of American émigrés, was significantly different from the rest of Mexico, causing clashes with the central government. A key issue of disagreement was that of slavery. The Mexican government wanted to abolish slavery, which they ended up doing in 1829. But settlers in Texas were heavily dependent on slave labor. Tensions broke out into open hostilities starting in 1835. The Mexican authorities felt uncomfortable with the idea of so many Texans being armed, given the difficult political situation. In response to the demands to disarm, Texans raised a homemade white banner with a picture of a cannon and the words, "Come and take it." The Texans fought to chase Mexican forces out of Texas all throughout 1835. But in early 1836, the Mexican army's retreat from modern-day San Antonio left the Texans with a dilemma. San Antonio was an absolutely must-hold position for them, but their only defense there was an old Spanish mission. Knowing that the Mexicans were regrouping to try to retake the city, the Texans set out to fortify this mission, the Alamo, as best they could. They sent for the best reinforcements they could get. One of these was Davy Crockett, whose opposition to the Indian Removal Act had cost him his seat in Congress. His own spin on the GTT message for his fellow statesmen was, "Y'all can go to hell, and I will go to Texas." The Mexican army, laying siege to the Alamo for 11 days, finally breached its walls. The Texans were outnumbered 10-1, and Mexican General Santa Anna had given orders that no combatant should be left alive. A month later, when the Mexican army engaged a Texan force in present-day LaPorte, Texas, they were really out for blood. "Remember the Alamo" was their battle cry as they engaged Santa Anna, whose overwhelming victory at San Antonio had caused him to make several miscalculations leading into the Battle of San Jacinto. Santa Anna himself was captured during the battle and forced to sign a peace recognizing the newly independent Republic of Texas. Texas's successful revolution against Mexico can really be seen as the canary in the coal mine for what was to come in the United States of America. First, there had been South Carolina's nullification crisis, which for now had come to nothing. And now this. A conflict that had started with a group of rebels' taunts to "come and take it," and their willingness to fight to the death for what they believed was their sacred right to their property should have given leaders in the United States pause. But maybe Texas's recent troubles could be chalked up to the spirit of the wild frontier. People had always been drawn to the call of wide-open spaces, and in particular, the fertile land along the Mississippi. The network of the Mississippi alluvial plain stretched over thousands of miles and could be navigated to the farthest reaches of the frontier and into the remotest pockets of the interior. Steamboats could steam up and down the river all year round, carrying their cargo of wheat and cotton from the farms that produced it to the great port of New Orleans. New Orleans, since being acquired from the French in 1803, played a major role in international trade since it was directly situated on America's superhighway, the Mississippi, and it opened into the Gulf of Mexico. Much like communities along America's eastern canals, cities and towns that sprung up along the Mississippi were looking to cash in on the hustle and bustle of commerce along the river. Towns like the fictional hamlet of St. Petersburg, Missouri, where for Huckleberry Finn, the river is a way of life. Mark Twain captures in Huck the belief that man is inherently good, as he wants to help his friend Jim get to freedom in contravention of the law and everything he's been taught. For Twain, the ideas and constructs of a society chasing progress can only corrupt. The Noble Savage of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau is as American as apple pie, having served as one model for the Founding Fathers in their framing of the Constitution. To Rousseau, men are best without the corrupting influence of ambition and greed that society so often promotes. Far better for Americans to seek life along the untamed shores of the Mississippi than the boardrooms of New York City. Andrew Jackson had promoted this kind of rugged individualism. Already, important distinctions were emerging between the two kinds of Americans. One who appreciated and benefited from the structures and protections of the government, and another who wanted new lands and opportunities and felt, like Jackson, that the federal government was hindering them. If you accept that American greatness comes from the up-by-your-bootstraps of de Tocqueville, seeking your name and your fortune through hard work, then you also have to accept that there were the Hucks pushing back on that, with the downsides of, quote, civilization and progress. Out of Rousseau grew transcendentalism, a movement that prized individuals' movement away from the trappings of society and reconnection with nature. Like the Hudson River School, it was also a reaction to modernity and industrialization, the quickening pace of life. But instead of being solely artistic, though artists did come out of the Transcendentalist movement, it was more like a governing philosophy, a way of life, a religion almost. A core concept of Transcendentalism was the Oversoul, the divine spirit that connected all things in nature, and adherents to the movement deliberately removed themselves from modern society so that they could better commune with this spirit. Like Henry David Thoreau in Walden, who chose to live like a hermit in the woods in order to connect with his inner noble savage without the push and pull of the competing forces in society. In Walden, Thoreau says, "It is hard to have a southern overseer. It is worse to have a northern one." For many Americans, seeing the chaos caused by financial panic and the growing tyranny of big cotton, the clear choice was to opt out. Communities developed to fulfill the many needs of those who desired this freedom. The new manifest destiny. Land gains had been made in a brief war with Mexico. There were debates over the Oregon Territory. Texas had applied to join the Union, and eager opportunists rushed to strike it rich in California. So you want to move west? Well, first, there are some things needed to make that possible. There were the wholesale outfitters who supplied food, tools, and other equipment for the miner looking to strike it rich, as well as the family looking to set up their own homestead. Companies like Studebaker built the canvas-covered wagons that immediately spring to mind when thinking about westward movement. A great deal of infrastructure needed to be put in place to maintain a burgeoning, near-constant movement to new territories. A supply line made up of places like St. Joseph and Independence Rock in Missouri and Fort Laramie in Wyoming was needed along the entire route to sustain travelers on their way. This meant that supply depots like these needed a reliable source of communication with the East. Stagecoaches, which carried passengers and mail across the continent, were vital, and one company, Wells Fargo, developed such a sturdy reputation for safe passage that it was able to diversify into handling people's money. The siren song of gold proved just as strong for people in the 19th century as it had for people in the 15th and 16th centuries. People looking to make their fortune in California by panning for gold started showing up in large numbers, kitted out, eager, and completely naive. Because prospecting for gold isn't really what most people think it is. The Humphrey Bogart movie Treasure of the Sierra Madre does a great job of showing how the obsession with finding gold can drive a person insane, and how even when successful, your spoils aren't what you're expecting. The gold they find is dust, panned from rivers and painstakingly collected, in the hopes that enough will be found to reconstitute into something that's actually worth anything. The reality of the gold rush was that the best way to make your fortune was catering to the people looking for gold, by becoming a wholesaler or a supplier of equipment like picks and shovels. Levi Strauss, an immigrant seeking to make his fortune, began selling dry goods to would-be prospectors. He even invented a kind of reinforced denim pant to aid them in their work. Hopes of financial gain. Making one's fortune either panning for gold or acquiring land were definitely what drew a lot of people to the West. But manifest destiny, a term first used by a newspaper columnist to describe the duty of all Americans to settle the West, was a larger concept. The collective wealth of the United States certainly was a consideration in westward expansion. A wealthy nation is a strong nation. But like the Monroe Doctrine, manifest destiny was a chance for America to mark its territory. In reality, it's a philosophy driven largely by fear. As the English and then the French had been driven out or paid off, the United States no longer had to fear on that front. But surely that wouldn't be enough. Potentially anyone who lived in close proximity to the United States of America and wasn't American posed a threat. For more hawkish policymakers, manifest destiny meant that America could either dominate its neighbors or be dominated in turn. The United States government was beginning to think like a major player in the game of conquest, and if it was going to do that, then it would need a more efficient means of moving people and material from point A to point B. The application of steam technology in transportation vehicles had been adapted to land. The first steam engines were not much, just open carts for carrying people short distances. Not much more effective than horse-drawn carriages. But in 1849, the valve-operated coreless steam engine was developed. It was 30% more fuel efficient, and its basic principles of steam management allowed industrialists to develop better locomotive engines. Train cars, too, became more comfortable and better for longer periods of travel. Now, if America could only build enough track to connect the entire country, there would be nothing that could stop its dominance. The United States government was beginning to think like a major player in the game of conquest, and if it was going to do that, then it would need a more efficient means of moving people and material from point A to point B. The application of steam technology in transportation vehicles had been adapted to land. The first steam engines were not much, just open carts for carrying people short distances. Not much more effective than horse-drawn carriages. But in 1849, the valve-operated coreless steam engine was developed. It was 30% more fuel efficient, and its basic principles of steam management allowed industrialists to develop better locomotive engines. Train cars, too, became more comfortable and better for longer periods of travel. Now, if America could only build enough track to connect the entire country, there would be nothing that could stop its dominance. America was a machine bent on expansion, and different places became cogs in that machine. Places like Chicago and St. Louis, whose Midwestern location made them a perfect entry point into the West. Chicago, with its position on Lake Michigan, had originally been established as a canal town, but with the emergence of rail travel, it was fast becoming an important hub for the railroads. The fact that a large volume of freight and agricultural product passed through Chicago created an environment where people could invest in futures. That is, they could bet on the future success of the coming season's crop by agreeing to buy it before it was produced, a process that gave farmers financial security in the event of emergency and allowed them to invest in growing their enterprises. St. Louis was an important port town on the Mississippi River. The wholesale outfitting of settlers and opportunists heading west was only possible because goods produced in other parts of the country could be gathered there after traveling down the superhighway of the Mississippi. Both Chicago and St. Louis experienced explosive growth in the first half of the 19th century, of people seeking to cash in on the boom in Western migration, as well as people heading west who didn't quite make it all the way. It was a trend across the country, with more people moving to cities and towns as the Industrial Revolution created new opportunities. By 1860, almost half the country was engaged in non-agricultural labor. The forces of mechanization and exploitation of material resources had changed the face of modern life, just as the Hudson River Valley School had feared. But in its wake, it afforded people the chance to move to population centers, to improve their lives with the trappings of modernity. Life in towns meant greater interaction with one's neighbors, a degree of socialization that would be impossible in a rural setting. Teas and sewing circles occupied ladies able to enjoy afternoons of leisure, and gatherings like these could form much of the basis for local politics. The Todds of Lexington, Kentucky, were particularly famous for their political soirees, frequented by leading lights in the Whig Party, like Henry Clay, and a young congressman named Abraham Lincoln. Another benefit of the move away from agricultural labor is that it allowed for the movement of more people into higher-paying jobs, creating conditions for a Victorian middle class. With the accession of Queen Victoria, society's sensibilities had changed, on both sides of the Atlantic. Victoria succeeded two of her uncles as monarch, and her reign was a repudiation of her pleasure-loving, somewhat scandalous predecessors. Victoria stood for moral uprightness and family values. The royal family became a model for the rest of the nation and the world, with its ideal image of restrained domesticity. But as wholesome and aspirational as Victorian life could be, it was also somewhat rigid, without the same romance of earlier times. It can seem a little unnerving, and perhaps it's no coincidence that Gothic, the aesthetic style of the time, came to have the alternative connotation and meaning that we know today. In a short story written many decades later, The Yellow Wallpaper, the stifling nature of being a woman is inextricably linked with the sight of this overbearing design motif. The rise of the middle class of the Victorian era was due to the economic expansion made possible by the cities. When we last left New York City, it was an expanding urban center looking to take over the island of Manhattan. By the mid-19th century, it was looking to take over the world. Financiers in New York had London in their sights, and British industrialists were not unconscious of the fact that America was coming for the crown. They weren't there just yet, but they were the ones to watch out for. There wasn't much room for nostalgia or sentimentality in this bustling metropolis. Buildings were being torn down and rebuilt so that the face of the city was constantly changing, much like it still does today. Houses that had been the height of fashion one year were quickly outdated the next, as people strove to be on the cutting edge. The New York Evening Post commented, "There is too much disposition among those who put up houses to build in a different style from their neighbors." New York, since Dutch times, had been the way station, from the ships docking in the harbor to the Erie Canal ferrying in freight from all over the country. Bankers had always set up their headquarters in the city because that's where the product would come through to be bought and sold, and where entrepreneurs looking to expand would come to raise capital. John Jacob Astor's success with his American Fur Company came from the fact that, from his New York base, he was able to move his product around the country, becoming a very important wholesale outfitter for the multitude heading west. But while the city was home to great wealth, it was also home to great poverty. Again, much like today. Since New York was a port of entry and lots of people arriving came with nothing, they stayed. 5 Points, a neighborhood near present-day Columbus Circle, in what is now Chinatown, became so notorious for its slums that even Charles Dickens, jaded chronicler of urban misery, took notice in horror. The neighborhood had been created by draining collect ponds, but this process was so poorly done that the ground remained uneven and the area bred diseases like typhus and cholera. The residents of this area were poor immigrants, escaping the potato famine in Ireland, as well as poor Black Americans. Among the rotting and decrepit tenements were dance halls, brothels, saloons, and cheap theaters, haunted by street gangs like the Bowery Boys, who hassled immigrants and ran their rackets. In the center of Five Points was the Tombs, a prison with 2 sections for housing men and women. Conditions in 5 Points led desperate men and women to vice and murder, and the Tombs was the terrifying fortress where these sorry individuals were locked away. Black Americans, as well as some Irish immigrants, had formed their own separate enclave in what is today Midtown Manhattan. Seneca Village had formed in the 1820s when 2 black entrepreneurs, Andrew Williams and Epiphany Davis, as well as African Methodist Zion Church, bought several lots of land in the area. Other black families began to settle in this new autonomous community. By 1850, the little village was thriving, with a school for black students, multiple churches, a burial ground, some 50 homes, and space for gardening and livestock. But in the early 1850s, city leaders determined for the health and beautification of the city, a large amount of space should be set aside for the creation of a large, centrally located park. The park would include 775 landscaped acres, extending from 59th to 106th Street, between 5th and 8th Avenue. This meant the removal of Seneca Village through the process of eminent domain. As Central Park rose in Upper Manhattan, the memory of Seneca Village was forgotten, replaced by the narrative that, quote, the site of what was to become Central Park was probably the ugliest on the island, with 2 shanty towns inhabited by rag pickers, whose pigs and goats roamed freely. But we've seen that that's not true, thanks to the rediscovery of the true history of Seneca Village by the Central Park Conservancy. Quote, the fact that many residents were property owners contradicts some common misperceptions during the mid-19th century that the people living on the land slated for the park were poor squatters living in shanties. While some residents lived in shanties and in crowded conditions, most lived in 2-story homes. Census records show that residents were employed. Records also show that most children who lived in Seneca Village attended school. It goes to show that the history we learn is often calcified, told a certain way for so long that we just assume that it's the most accurate version. Often digging a little deeper and questioning how exactly it is we know what has come down to us can tell a much different story. It really raises the question of what other people and events are hiding in history without the recognition they deserve. Urban development projects like Central Park were meant to cater to a city whose rapid growth was posing new questions about modernity. Could an urban center meet the needs of a population that kept increasing by building infrastructure to address health and safety matters? The use of gaslight lamps in the city since the early 1820s was a boon to public safety, but use of gas lamps didn't end on the streets. The New York Gas Company had installed gas pipes running under the streets and into the commercial buildings in some homes of New York City. I think it's hard to appreciate just how revolutionary the advance of being able to see at night was for people in the 19th century. Really see, not just glimpse things through the shadows of candlelight. Life had always, for the most part, followed the rhythms of the seasons. When the sun went down, there wasn't really much point in trying to fight the darkness. Candlelight might suffice for social events and settings, but it doesn't allow for much serious work to get done. Now, with the discovery of petroleum in 1859, gaslight had become an even cheaper resource, and people found one less way they were constrained by the world around them. Another improvement the city was beginning to make in people's lives was regular access to clean water. In 1837, the Croton River in upstate New York was dammed, and miles of aqueduct began to carry water to reservoirs in Manhattan. For the first time, homes in New York City had running water. The nicer ones, that is. New York's wealthier residents built water closets and showers inside their dwellings for ease of access, ensuring more reliable waste removal and daily cleansing routines. But even for less wealthy New Yorkers, a revolution in personal hygiene was beginning. Public baths, like the People's Washing and Bathing Establishment, were established as philanthropic ventures, where for a small fee, people could come and wash. The ability to maintain personal cleanliness allowed people their dignity, since neatness of appearance was tied to moral fiber. But it was also hoped that by encouraging clean habits in the general populace, the city could help prevent the spread of disease. The Croton Aqueduct also enabled the construction of public fountains and provided clean drinking water for anyone to come and collect fresh and sanitary water, for cooking, for cleaning, or for drinking, stood on major streets, presenting a solution to what had been a serious public health issue. Cholera, often a waterborne disease, was incredibly deadly in urban settings, since potentially hundreds of people could be drawing from the same contaminated local source, perpetuating the spread of deadly pathogens. With the source of the water now located far away from the dirty daily life of the city, people could trust that it was safe to consume, and the overall threat of cholera was greatly reduced. But one side effect of people now going to these new water sources instead of the old city wells was that the water level of these wells didn't go down reliably, causing flooding. The solution? Expand the sewer system. Sewers had existed in New York City since the time of Dutch New Amsterdam, but the new lengths of tunnels that the city built were intended to address these flooding issues by whisking away the excess water when well levels overflowed. Of course, another fortunate byproduct of an expanded sewage system is that it also helped remove the waste that was contaminating the well water in the first place. People of New York could extend their daylight hours and control their water source, and starting in 1832, they began to implement smoother and more reliable forms of transportation. This was the year that the city began to introduce horse cars to the streets, carriages that were drawn by horse, but that ran along rails embedded in the road. The first horse car, operated by the New York and Harlem Railroad, ran from 4th, or what is now Park, up to the Harlem River. The regularity of the track made the horse cars efficient and reliable, and since they were designed to accommodate up to 30 people, they were overall a much cheaper means of transportation for the general public. The fact that they were built along rails meant that these cars could be converted to steam and later electrified, becoming the trolley cars that were to become an essential part of urban life in America. The streetcars meant that ordinary people could go to and from work in a timely manner, or easily move about the city on errands or in their leisure time, making the realities of day-to-day life a little less time-consuming. And like the addition of gaslight and the access to safe drinking water, it meant that people's lives were just that much more livable. You wouldn't really have thought of a city like that before, in terms of the experience of its people. But since advances in transportation and health and safety, attitudes were changing, because now visionaries and reformers could see a future where everyone, regardless of socioeconomic status, could live in dignity and comfort. With American cities especially, the fact that they were literally breaking new ground meant that they could be deliberate about how new areas were arranged and built up, like cities implementing the grid system. New York City in particular has always been described as a jungle. But prior to the 19th century, all cities were kind of like that, an unforgiving landscape where you would have to fight for survival. To some extent, it will continue to be this way, but for the first time, people with the means to do so, including major figures like Queen Victoria's husband, Prince Albert, were thinking about how to make the city a place where ordinary could survive, maybe even thrive one day. It's the Industrial Revolution and all the advances that come with it that paved the way for people to even conceive of a middle class. People who may never be extremely rich, but who are no longer automatically relegated to the ranks of the extremely poor. History was crossing a threshold of what was and wasn't possible. Suddenly, there was greater opportunity for a wider range of people to live a life that they might actually get some enjoyment from. To that end, New York's wealthier citizens funded cultural institutions across the city. A series of libraries was built around Astor Place, at the intersection of East 8th and Lafayette Streets, with the aim of allowing people to improve their minds through education. John Jacob Astor had helped build the area into one of the more upscale neighborhoods in New York, and it was here that he wanted his public lending library to stand as an aspirational ideal, that anyone, like himself, could come from humble beginnings, yet through hard work and ingenuity, make it to such a fashionable address. New York City certainly was the place to do it. Already in the 19th century, it was coming to be known as the city that never slept. The constant change that was so often lamented could also be seen as a positive. It meant that there could be openings for someone or something new. And there were plenty of people eager to walk the walk and embrace the trappings of someone who had arrived. Broadway boasted a line of upscale shops selling dry goods, as well as a new retail model, the department store. Establishments like Lord & Taylor's were still fairly modest, compared to what they would become, but they were still a novel concept, that a place could become your one-stop shop, catering to all your different needs. Broadway would have been overwhelming if you were new to the city, and if you had the means, you would have been spoiled for choice. The growing city tried to be every bit as fancy as its more sophisticated European counterparts. It was no secret that New York was a city of Anglophiles. The city had constructed its own Crystal Palace on 42nd Street, inspired by London's. Opera in the city was so heavily influenced by the British style that Irish immigrants staged a riot, believing the city's elites were too enthralled with everything they had come to America to get away from. And perhaps there was some truth to that. After all, the British had made New York a focus of their campaign during the Revolutionary War, believing that they would find a sympathetic population. But perhaps the real truth is that New York wasn't so much in awe of London as studying it, priming itself to one day take its place as the business and financial capital of the world. In Washington, Whig lawmakers worked to effectively aid and manage that growth. Led by Henry Clay, they faithfully clung to the theory behind the American system: invest money in infrastructure to aid business, eliminate barriers to growth, and create a level playing field. The last pillar had always been built on the idea of a central bank guiding fiscal policy, but since Andrew Jackson had killed the second bank of the United States, the Whigs were eager to restore some balance to the American system. So they focused on the second pillar: protecting business interests by blocking foreign competition through tariffs. At this point, it's perhaps no surprise to you that the tariff they passed in 1842 came to be known as the Black Tariff, due to how much it was hated. Farmers were the chief opponents of the tariff, again, unsurprisingly, but they also represented a much larger discontent in the American public. Cheaper goods might have been bad news for American companies, but lots of people needed more affordable choices. Congress should look out for businesses that provide livelihood for swaths of the country, but what about people who earn their living in other ways? Shouldn't Congress be looking to eliminate their barriers to success as well? For better or worse, the Whigs represented forward-looking America, the one that saw democracy as a tool to promote prosperity. It was an outlook that was increasingly causing more tension between the industrialized North and the largely rural South. The irony of this was that the South developed the way it had because it was financially incentivized to do so by northern cities. The U.S. economy was built on textile mills. Much of the raw material came from the rural South. The trade in raw cotton alone was big business for the United States. By 1850, the country was producing 2/3 of the world's cotton, and by 1860, cotton made up 60% of American exports. But everyone was aware of the ugly reality behind this prized commodity. Going back to Jamestown, planters in the temperate climate had made that same bargain, that growing one crop in bulk and selling it wholesale was an easier way to make greater profit quicker. They chose the cash crop route over the governor's more conventional wisdom, that they practiced subsistence farming. Planters built fortunes and legacies entirely off of enslaved skill and labor. A whole way of life entirely dependent on the buying and selling of human beings, working them all day, locking them in at night, and separating them from their offspring as if they were animals. Worse than animals. You wouldn't beat a horse bloody, remove a limb if it ran away, or sexually assault it. Brutality and fear are necessary to take a people's freedom from them. After centuries, the plantation had become so baked into the Southern economy that it was difficult to operate outside of it. The wealthy landowners had such massive operations that they drew everything around them into their orbit with an almost gravitational pull. Cotton was firmly ingrained as the main economic engine, and there was really no backup plan. That could be a pretty sweet life for the lucky few. Being waited on hand and foot, not having to worry about training for a career or occupation, since you could live off the land, without actually having to lift a finger to work it yourself. The South had, in effect, become the very thing the founders had sought to escape, a landed aristocracy that hadn't distinguished itself by merit, yet was the dominating force in Southern life. If you're essentially an American lord, and you've already found such easy money, why pursue other intellectual or cultural endeavors? Why innovate? Comparisons are often made between ancient Rome and classical Athens and the United States, especially since these served as models for the founding fathers. But the antebellum South in particular resembled another ancient civilization entirely, Sparta. You probably know about Sparta because of its famous last stand at the Pass of Thermopylae, immortalized in the graphic novel 300. But aside from that one moment of glory, do we really remember the Spartans for anything else? No, they're one-hit wonders. Visit the site of Ancient Sparta today and there's almost nothing left. No impressive Acropolis like Athens, no works of philosophy or theater, no outstanding piece of sculpture or work of art. We don't have any significant remnants of their culture because the Spartans didn't prioritize it. They were a warrior society who dedicated their lives to the martial arts, and the reason they did that was because they had to. Sparta was a slave society. The food was grown by neighbors who they'd forcibly enslaved, and to maintain their dominance over them, they had to constantly be vigilant and ready to subdue them with violence at a moment's notice. Is it really any wonder that societies in the antebellum South should be the same? It was a society, like Sparta, bent on one single-minded purpose, the subjugation of a group of people for economic production. Look at Alabama, for example. What artifacts can it boast of from that pre-war period? Did they have factories? A few. Not enough to support any other industry outside of the plantation system. Did they have libraries? Some, but they suffered from lack of funding. Lending libraries just weren't as relevant to the operation of their society. There were no hospitals until right before the Civil War, when they realized they would need them. It made sense, seeing as there was no medical school. Antebellum society in Alabama lacked museums, theaters, public gardens, dance halls, or really anywhere you could go to find culture. It was a society that existed to serve its economy, an economy dependent on the institution of slavery. And like Sparta, it didn't leave much legacy behind, other than its commitment to maintaining the status quo, through intimidation, violence, and single-minded focus. These aristocrats' power rested in plantation agriculture, and so everyone else's focus must be plantation agriculture as well. This despite the fact that less than 1% of the population could be considered part of the planter class. It was prohibitively expensive to become a big landowner, yet there was no financial or political incentive to innovate or evolve away from this system. The planet that was the plantation so dictated the livelihoods of everyone around it that any threat to the cotton harvest was also a threat to the smiths who fixed the cotton gins and other agricultural tools the vendors who provided dry goods, and all the other tradespeople who counted the plantation as a major customer. Slavery isolated Southerners into a rigid economic system, and in the shadow of large landowners, society basically resembled medieval feudalism. Aside from the barbarism of slavery, enslaved people were denied hopes and dreams for the future, in service to a small minority. So why did most people accept it? When someone goes against popular sentiment and everything they've ever been told, it's noteworthy because that is not the norm. In this way, Rousseau was right. Society's worst ideas can corrupt the inherent goodness of the individual. The dominant idea in the South was that slavery was in keeping with the natural order of things. It would be preached from the pulpit on Sundays and enforced daily. Any agitating to the contrary, or even possessing materials deemed to be abolitionists in nature, was illegal. So much for the First Amendment. In 1835, Pastor Amos Dresser was sentenced to be whipped in Nashville, Tennessee, after he was found with anti-slavery writings. The public nature of this punishment was very much intentional. People were meant to know what happened to anyone who might get any funny ideas, that all men really were created equal. Keep any guilty consciences to yourself, and accept that this is just the way things are. And if you're forced to live with that status quo, then you had better learn to quash any doubts. Frederick Douglass explained the cognitive dissonance required for decent people to accept slavery. On arriving at the house of Sophia Auld in Baltimore, he describes this transformation. My new mistress proved to be all she appeared when I first met her at the door, a woman of the kindest heart and finest feelings. Finest feelings. She had never had a slave under her control previously to myself. I was utterly astonished at her goodness. Her face was made of heavenly smiles, and her voice of tranquil music. But alas, this kind heart had but a short time to remain such. The fatal poison of irresponsible power was already in her hands, and gradually commenced its infernal work. That cheerful eye, under the influence of slavery, eventually became red with rage. That voice, made all of sweet accord, changed to one of harsh and horrid discord, and that angelic face gave place to that of a demon. It's wrong to look on people of the past as uniquely evil. For one, it lets us off the hook. It's easy for us to have a false sense of superiority from where we are. But if we were put in that same position, how likely is it that we'd find the strength to act differently? Do you think you could really swim against the current when all of society is conditioning you, sometimes violently, to stick to the status quo? Are we so great at overlooking what's most convenient for the sake of ethics now? What we might consider evil is often a lot closer and shockingly mundane than we would like to think. All that it takes for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. The bottom line for Southerners was that they believed, whether through greed, intimidation, or tacit acceptance, that no path to prosperity existed without slavery. So what right did the federal government have to dictate to them about it? The issue of slavery was becoming more and more contentious. Abolitionist sentiment was being fueled by activists like William Lloyd Garrison and his paper The Liberator. Without the same pressure as Southerners to look the other way for the good of society, Northerners, if not outright abolitionists, were becoming increasingly uncomfortable with slavery, and especially slave owners' dominance in politics. The uneasy peace between these two irreconcilable positions couldn't hold for much longer. California's entry into the Union presented a challenge. Here was a large state that existed both north and south of the 1820 Compromise line. Remember the good old days of of 1820, when everybody had all those good feelings. What's more, the North's increasing opposition to slavery, or at least to planter society, meant that northern cities were places where enslaved people could self-emancipate and hope to live unbothered. Southerners felt that if they were going to be subject to the rule of the federal government, then it should protect what it deemed to be their interest. So naturally, Congress came together to mend fences on this point. As before, everyone could agree to forego some of the items on their wish list for the sake of unity. Once more, it was Henry Clay who was the strongest voice urging compromise. He warned of disastrous consequences if members of Congress could not agree to give up some of their regional interests for the sake of the Republic. The resulting Compromise of 1850 stated that California would be admitted as a free state. The territories of Utah and New Mexico would be organized, with each deciding by popular sovereignty if they would allow slavery. And there would be a strict fugitive slave law that would require citizens of all states to assist. Only the 1850 reboot was not as well received as the 1820 version. The delicate balance between regions, the idea that one could live how it chose as long as it didn't interfere with another, was shattered. What the fugitive slave law essentially said was that if slavery existed anywhere, technically it existed everywhere. For a region that claimed to be the champion of states' rights, the South sure had no problem trampling on northern state sovereignty. Shortly after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law, the daughter of a preacher, Harriet Beecher Stowe, wrote a novel in an attempt to humanize the issue of slavery. Though perhaps ham-fisted in places, Uncle Tom's Cabin follows main character Tom's life in bondage, and shows his epiphany that just because an institution is deemed to be lawful and correct does not make it right. Rousseau, once again. Clearly, Uncle Tom's struggles and his final realization struck a chord. The book became a bestseller and seems to have shaped popular opinion. As more people came to the opinion that slavery could no longer be tolerated, the political parties of the day faced a dilemma. More Southerners joined the anti-elite, anti-institution Democratic Party, pushing out the anti-slavery Northerners. The Whig Party was also imploding over the issue of slavery. A new party was needed for these cast-offs, and so, at a small meeting in Ripon, Wisconsin, the Republican Party was formed in 1854. The first Republican platform stated the party's commitment to strong government and investment in internal improvements, and above all, it condemned the institution of slavery. Politicians were finally coming to a fundamental truth that they should have known from the beginning. Slavery was just not compatible with the American dream. Not only did it contradict the central founding idea, that all men are created equal, but it undermined the meritocracy and the freedom of opportunity that America supposedly promised. Slavery created a planter class of landed gentry who from birth had a built-in political advantage. In certain parts of the country, there was really no way for anyone not already born to that life to break into it. When you look at the past, it can seem radically unfamiliar. There's the famous line, "The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there." But the thing is, they don't. Not really. The technology and the trappings might be different, and the questions they were debating aren't quite the same as the ones we have today. But human nature hasn't changed all that much. There were still families around dinner tables debating the rightness or the wrongness of their politics and their society. There were the young radicals arguing for social justice, the older reactionaries bemoaning the fact that things were changing so rapidly, and the appeasers, determined that there was some middle ground that could get everyone to get along. Then there were the people who would simply prefer not to get involved. Life was complicated enough without the larger political questions. Society at large began to reflect the tension in politics boiling over into communities and family units. As early as 1833, One Washington resident said, "I fear the seeds are already sown, whose fruit will be disunion." How can we live with one another when we can't agree on a base definition of what is for the good of society? How fragile democracy is when it's founded on the understanding that we can agree on these basics. But for some things, there can be no compromise. Where there can be no compromise, unfortunately, there is violence. In 1854, Congress had passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, stating that the newly organized territories of Kansas and Nebraska would be able to determine their status as either free or slave states by popular vote. This repealed the Compromise of 1820, which established that slavery would not be allowed north of latitude 3630. The result was chaos. Years of confusion and electoral fraud led to open violence. Slavery and anti-slavery partisans came from out of state to intimidate. People were murdered to reduce the numbers of one faction or the other. In May 1856, pro-slavery rioters invaded Lawrence, Kansas, and burned and looted anti-slavery homes and businesses. In Congress, Republican Senator Charles Sumner denounced the violence, holding pro-slavery Democrats, like South Carolina Senator Andrew Butler, morally responsible. The next day, Representative Preston Brooks, a relative of Butler's, beat Sumner severely while he was sitting at his desk in the Senate chamber. It took Sumner 3 years to recover from his injuries. The New York Times responded by saying of Southerners, "We understand perfectly well that nothing could give them more exquisite pleasure than to kill us all." Governor Henry Wise of Virginia, in defense of Brooks's actions, said, "How can we stand continual aggression everywhere? In Congress, in the pulpit, in the press?" Which is an interesting way to put it when trying to explain someone's actual aggression. The response to the Sumner affair was so heatedly partisan that people were worried that any suggestion in Congress that either Sumner or Brooks was in the wrong might erupt in more violence. The 2/3 vote necessary to expel Brooks from Congress, again for nearly beating a guy to death, couldn't be reached. Brooks's constituents were so enamored of his actions that not only did they re-elect him, they sent him Keynes's presents. Clearly, the capacity for rational discussion was at an end, as each side dug in and prepared for the rupture they all felt was coming. And it came at Harper's Ferry. John Brown was a man of strong convictions. The first was his faith. The second was that slavery was an unconscionable evil that could not be accepted in any form. He and his sons had been active in the anti-slavery struggle in Kansas, but now he decided to put his most radical plan into action. He would attempt to go into the heart of slave country and foment rebellion. Harper's Ferry, Virginia, was the site of a federal armory. Brown's plan was to take the town and the armory, and from there begin to free all the enslaved people in the South. It was an overly ambitious plan, which the government squashed pretty quickly. 10 years earlier, Henry David Thoreau, the famed author of Walden, had gone to jail for not paying taxes. His essay explanation for why he didn't pay his taxes has become the template for revolutionaries from the suffragettes to Gandhi to Martin Luther King. It came to be titled Civil Disobedience, and it stated that when the laws of a country were unjust, the people had a moral right to disobey them, even if that meant going to prison. The Transcendentalists' argument was the ultimate expression of Rousseau's ideas, that man's own moral compass is a far better guide than society's. John Brown's stand at Harper's Ferry was a fairly extreme version of this theory, but he stood by the idea that God's law is higher than man's. At his trial, he said, "I see a book which I suppose to be the Bible, that teaches me to remember them that are in bonds as bound with them." Hebrews 13:3. I endeavor to act up to that instruction. I believe that to have interfered as I have done, in behalf of his despised poor, was not wrong, but right. While some abolitionists condemned the violence of the raid, they all recognized the moral rectitude of Brown's position, the thing calling itself the government of Virginia, but which in fact is but an organized conspiracy by one party of the people against the other and weaker, said Frederick Douglass. Shortly before his execution, John Brown said, "I am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away, but with blood." In this atmosphere, the midterm elections of 1858 naturally came down to the one issue on everyone's mind: slavery. In Illinois, the race for Senate became a standout moment because of the debate between the two candidates, Democrat Stephen Douglas and Republican Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln took the official Republican stance that slavery was about more than property rights. The institution was evil and should be halted, before being eventually abolished everywhere. Douglas ended up winning the election, but Lincoln had struck a chord with people with his House Divided speech. In it, he warned that the government couldn't endure half slave and half free. It was a viral moment for the 19th century, and it made Abraham Lincoln one to watch in the Republican Party. The 1860 Republican Convention took place in Chicago. Senator William H. Seward was definitely considered the favorite to clinch the nomination. Lincoln was there, and his political profile was not insignificant after his debate with Douglas, but no one seriously expected that the party would nominate a man who had twice lost his bid for Senate. But the field was full of candidates, and after Lincoln finished second on the first ballot, and no one received a majority, he was able to consolidate the support of other candidates who had finished behind him. This was still viewed as very much not the done thing, actively campaigning for oneself. But Lincoln always felt he had a destiny bigger than himself. Lincoln seriously scared the South, since he had made his position on slavery abundantly clear. He won the presidency without winning a single Southern state. It was the final straw. Epilogue. It's really interesting to think that there used to be an entire political party, the Whigs, that just doesn't exist today. It's interesting to think that the political landscape we take for granted might not exist in several generations. The question is, could today's major political parties die out so easily? The big parties are like parliamentary coalitions. They exist on a spectrum. Third parties are the proving grounds for the fringier political ideas. The math of the Electoral College means that there can only ever be two main parties at once, or else it gets hard for any one candidate to get a majority. So these third parties can be laboratories without necessarily having to worry about electability, and their more popular ideas can begin to creep into the mainstream. Since there are really only ever two viable party options at once, they draw in a lot of different characters. The party has to welcome a broad continuum of opinions if it wants to survive. The thing that will split a party apart is a single binary issue. Some policies can have a spectrum of solutions, but if the issue in question can only fall into the categories of for or against, problems are going to arise. And if it comes to that, a clean break, is it possible to separate without bitterness, or is some conflict to be expected? Most importantly to us, are we heading for another civil war with our current politics? The attempted assassination of the president at the White House Correspondents' Dinner is just one instance in a long line of recent incidents of political violence, including the murder of political commentator Charlie Kirk and two state lawmakers in Minnesota. No one has killed someone on the floor of the Senate yet, but instances of such extreme partisanship are scary. For now, ironically, I think we're actually more united than we have been in a while, just by the fact that we're all pretty dissatisfied with the state of things. Who can be sure how long the state of discontent might remain civil, or when the next major event might be? But we need to be able to talk about it. No matter how contentious it might get around dinner tables or at family gatherings, if we can't even talk about it, how can we ever hope to fix it? For a period of less than 20 years, the road to the Civil War is absolutely jam-packed. There's a whole war and several presidents that I just skipped completely. But I'm telling this story, so I get to determine what's important. And I'm far more interested in this story on the ground than I am in what was going on in Washington. The real action occurred in people's homes while no one was watching. That's where the resentment churned and started to boil over. But public opinion is never a monolith, and what is really troubling people is never obvious at first. It's the nuances that change over time that add up and combine into the big movements that no one sees coming. During the Blitz in London, the government had people keep diaries of their day-to-day lives. The fear of the nightly bombing raids, what rationing was like, and their larger fears about the war. The diaries were invaluable for later historians trying to make sense of that period. They captured the silent resolve of the British people to see out the threat and continue on to eventual victory in a way that government memoranda, often the only surviving documentation we have of the period, ever could. Today we do have better public opinion polling, but not about the smaller things, those little nuances that spell the coming of a larger trend. Perhaps the growing interest in reform movements, like Dorothea Dick's push for more humane mental institutions, was one of these smaller shifts in consciousness. People were beginning to re-examine the social contract, what they got from the government in return for giving up a portion of their freedom. The preamble of the Constitution, the foreword, which serves as a statement of intent, makes some promises about what the government will do for its citizens. We haven't really talked about those yet. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. In the early days of the Republic, the government didn't have the resources to take on public works projects, much bigger than maintaining some roads and running a postal service. But times were changing. Technology was improving. So it was a valid question. What did the Constitution mean by promoting the general welfare? It's a question we're still asking ourselves. And there are really a few ways to approach it. Let's look at it from the utilitarian perspective. If you promote the health of the general populace, they go on to make up a more productive workforce. They have less days missed due to illness, and a better quality of work when they show up, because they have the energy and strength necessary to not just do tasks, but maybe even innovate while they're on the job. Or you could see it from the idealistic perspective. If a person doesn't have their health to work and prosper, and that person isn't fortunate enough to have a wealthier relative to help them out, then they would just be stuck in a cycle of endless crushing poverty with no way out. That is the exact opposite of being free. It's interesting that this is also the time that evangelical tradition comes into being, because these tent revivals introduced a style of preaching that was almost like selling people religion. It was asking the congregation to examine their social contract with God, what He could do for them. It's how we get the prosperity gospel, which states that through a person's faith and good works, God would guarantee their prosperity. Blended in with our puritanical roots, it's become tied up in how we see ourselves as Americans today. Alexis de Tocqueville observed about Americans in 1835, hardly anything but money remains to create strongly marked differences between them. And I guess there's something positive in that. One person's dollar is as green as the next, and it means that it is possible for a person to change their station in life through their own effort. But if we base the idea of the American dream on the attainment of wealth, then we look at it as almost a moral failing when people don't have it. They must not have put in the work for God to bless them with prosperity. It also creates an ugly competition to acquire the most. Greed is, unfortunately, just something that is part of human nature. But it kicks into overdrive when a society believes that success is completely based on merit, that only the fittest survive and come out on top. It's a way of thinking that works in theory, but runs into problems in the real world. That's something I talk about more in the economics episode. Maybe it's reading too much into things with the benefit of hindsight to see the Gothic heaviness of the landscape as a premonition of what was to come. But studying this period in American history, it's impossible not to feel a creeping darkness.